And not why you're here. But I do know that we need more of this. We need more to recognize ourselves as a community of reflection, a never-ending carnival of reciprocity. I just acquired the taste this year. Some of you too, I hope. And it doesn't leave the tongue easily. The savor of exchange, reconsideration, ardor, conviction, seriousness, frivolity. Not that it comes easily or even naturally. We know it's the perpetual risk in academic careers, the segmented life, disassembled into broken bits, the next meeting, next essay, next coffee. Yet we also know, we know somewhere, that we need to make our conversations ongoing. Not once and then forgotten, but a habit of thinking together. Remembering what we said last Tuesday. Building and ramifying to bring the flourishing life nearer and the life of the humanities larger. So when I thank you for coming, I happen to mean it. I'm grateful. I know some of you may be here intending only to come out for your own edification, your private and personal satisfaction. But whether you mean it or not, and know it or not, you're part of the cause and campaign of the humanities. Don't go away. When we started 15 months ago launching the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, we were desperate to make something out of nothing. My own motto was, energy now, structure later. And the very first thing that energy told me to do was to invite Martha Nussbaum to Charlottesville. Now I see that structure would have told me that too. Professor Nussbaum fits so well into the shape of our canopy. She is its high tent pole. And to perform the honors owed to a tent pole, to perform with all due ceremony, to give a fit introduction as he is so well suited and prepared to do, I ask Professor Mitch Green of Philosophy to stand and deliver.
Thanks very much. Martha Nussbaum is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago, appointed in the Law School and Philosophy Department. She's an associate in Classics and Political Science departments, a member of the Committee on Southern Asian Studies, and a board member of the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago as well. She received her BA from NYU, her MA and PhD from Harvard. She has taught at Harvard, Brown, and Oxford universities, in addition to Chicago. From 1986 to 1993, Ms. Nussbaum was a research advisor at the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, a part of the United Nations University. She has chaired the American Philosophical Association's Committee on International Cooperation, the Committee on the Status of Women, and the Committee for Public Philosophy. In 1999 to 2000, she was one of the 3 presidents of the association, delivering a presidential address in the Central Division. Ms. Nussbaum has been a member of the Council of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the board of the American Council of Learned Societies. She received the Brandeis Creative Arts Award in Nonfiction for 1990, and the Penn Spielvogel Diamondstein Award for the Best Collection of Essays in 1991. Her book, Cultivating Humanity, won the Ness Book Award of the Association of American Colleges and Universities in 1998, and the Grawemeyer Award in Education in 2002. Sex and Social Justice won the Book Award of the North American Society for Social Philosophy in 2000. Hiding from Humanity won the Association of American University Publishers Professional and Scholarly Book Award for Law in 2004. Professor Nussbaum has received honorary degrees from over 40 colleges and universities in the US, Canada, Asia, Africa, and Europe, including Grinnell, Williams, the University of Athens, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, Louvain, Toronto, the New School, the University of Haifa, Emory, Bielefeld, Ohio State, Georgetown, and the University of the Free State in South Africa. Her scholarly work has had an extraordinary range. Originally, her focus was on ancient Greek philosophy, and in The Fragility of Goodness, she fashioned a distinctive and influential reading of Plato's Symposium in which human vulnerability is emphasized over the power of reason to lead us to flourishing. Her later work continues to draw on Greek philosophy, including Aristotle and the Stoics, but has branched out into such areas as feminist ethics, the emotions, political philosophy, the value of liberal education, the relations of emotions, for instance, shame and disgust, to the law, and the educative prowess of literature. In addition, Ms. Nussbaum has collaborated with the economist Amartya Sen in developing the well-known, very influential capabilities approach as a contribution to political philosophy, which has also had significant policy implications. Aside from her academic achievements and accolades, Ms. Nussbaum has become one of the most high-profile academics in American public life. The Boston Globe has hailed her as America's most prominent philosopher of public life. She's listed in a 2008 Wikipedia poll of top 100 public intellectuals, just below Larry Summers and David Petraeus. Though I suspect that list might change a little bit if it were updated. Here in Virginia, we're deeply committed to the value of liberal education, and we should be grateful to Ms. Nussbaum for her eloquent interventions in the public forum on its behalf. Particularly striking are her arguments in such works as Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, that liberal education is a bulwark of democracy. In work that brings us closer to the topic of today's talk, Professor Nussbaum connects the philosophy and moral psychology of emotions with questions of religious tolerance, another topic near to the hearts of those of us who are mindful of the three achievements that Thomas Jefferson insisted be inscribed on his tombstone. Many of us here also admire Professor Nussbaum's intellectual ferocity and willingness to challenge fashions. Her withering criticisms of Harold Bloom on the one hand and of Judith Butler on the other, together with many others in the New York Review of Books and the New Republic, make clear that she has no patience for in-groups or academic hemlines. She has also deployed the analytical tools that philosophy so carefully cultivates while refusing to succumb to its tendency to Mandarin aloofness. But in reflecting on her many and wide-ranging achievements both within and outside academia, it's easy to lose sight of her telos, and that is simply and unabashedly that of laying the foundations for a more just world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Nussbaum.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be back here in Charlottesville. It's been too long since I was last here. This book, of which an extract is going to be presented shortly, on religious intolerance, really grew out of a long-standing involvement with India, which had led me to feel that American and European Islamophobia was harming the situation of Muslims there who are actually being oppressed by the Hindu mobs and so on. But anyway, that's another story to be told maybe in the question time if that permits. And I should say I want the first three questions to come from students, so start thinking now. But anyway, then I got to thinking about how we should confront the new religious intolerance. So once, not very long ago, Americans and Europeans prided themselves on their enlightened attitudes of religious toleration and understanding. Although everyone knew that the history of the West has actually been characterized by intense religious animosity and violence, including such bloody episodes as the Crusades and the Wars of Religion, but including as well the quieter violence of colonial religious domination by Europeans in many parts of the world, and added to that of domestic anti-Semitism and often anti-Catholicism, and culminating in the horrors of Nazism, Europe and the US, until very recently, liked to think that these dark times were in the past, and that religious violence was somewhere else, in societies more allegedly primitive, less characterized by a heritage of Christian values. Today, we have many reasons to doubt this complacent self-assessment. Our situation calls urgently for searching, critical self-examination as we try to uncover the roots of ugly fears and suspicions that currently disfigure all Western societies. In April 2011, a law took effect in France, according to which it is illegal to cover the face in any public space, from parks to marketplaces to shops. Although the law does not mention the words women, Muslim, burka, or even veil, it was introduced by President Sarkozy as a ban on the burqa, which according to him imprisons women and threatens French values of dignity and equality. Although France is the first country to enact a full ban on the burqa in public space, similar restrictions are being considered all over Europe. Belgium and Italy are almost done in institutionalizing that, and Spain has been debating it also for some time. Meanwhile, many communities in Europe have even imposed regulations on the headscarf, which covers only the hair. In France, girls may not wear the headscarf in schools. Kosovo, with its large Muslim population, has imposed a similar requirement. In parts of Germany, Holland, Spain, and Belgium, the headscarf may not be worn by public employees, including teachers on the job, even though nuns and priests are permitted to teach in full habit. In Russia, Muslim women won the right to retain their headscarf in passport photos, but a teenage girl was recently expelled from school for wearing her headscarf, and one university has banned all headscarves. In Switzerland, after a campaign designed to appeal to fears of a Muslim takeover, a popular referendum voted by 57% to ban the construction of minarets associated with mosques, despite the fact that there are actually only 4 minarets in all of Switzerland out of 150 mosques. So in consequence, you could see that the architectural issue was purely symbolic. In July 2011, terror struck Northern Europe. Norwegian zealot Anders Behring Breivik murdered approximately 76 people in twin attacks, bombing government buildings in Oslo, and shooting young representatives of the Labour Party who had gathered on the island of Utoya for a youth camp. Breivik, who confessed to the crimes but denied every fault, released on the day of the attacks a 1,500-page manifesto in which he outlined a theory supporting his actions based on the idea that Europe must fight against the scourge of Islamicization. But just before this manifesto emerged, journalists around the world were already saying, oh, this must be a Muslim attack. In the US, things are so far a little bit better, owing to our long tradition of welcoming religious dissenters who express their conscientious commitments by dressing in non-standard ways. No bans on the burqa or headscarf are proposed, but in private employment there have indeed been difficulties. Imane Boudlal, a female Disneyland employee from Morocco, is suing Disney for the right to wear her headscarf during her job as hostess at Disneyland's Grand Californian Hotel. Her supervisors told her that it was not the Disney look. If she wanted to continue to wear it, she'd have to take a different job out of sight of customers. Another issue giving rise to controversy is the potential application of Sharia, Islamic law, to US citizens. In Oklahoma, an amendment to the state constitution, which passed with 70% of the vote, provides that Oklahoma courts may draw on US federal law, on common law, and, quote, if necessary, the law of another state, end quote, but may not, quote, look to the legal precepts of other nations or cultures, international law, or Sharia law, end quote. The law's primary architect, Rex Duncan, says, this is a war for the survival of America, this is a culture war. This ill-drafted and vague amendment, which was called the Save Our State Amendment, raises a host of problems, including the fact that the common law is of British origin, and the fact that the sweeping indictment of international law might be construed to apply to such recognized source of law as maritime law and treaties. But the most obvious issue is redundancy. The Establishment Clause of the US Constitution would already preclude enforcing in US courts the legal codes of any specific religion. So the law was challenged, rightly, by Islamic groups on the ground that it singled out Islam for special stigmatization, and the suit was found by a federal district judge to have merit on Establishment Clause grounds. She halted the law's implementation and later extended that restraining order indefinitely. The judge also noted, as have scholars, that the law would place a special burden on Muslims since courts are permitted to enforce contracts such as wills and marriage contracts that incorporate language drawn from other religious traditions. As my colleague, Professor Aziz Hook of the University of Chicago Law School wrote in the New York Times, the bans would deprive Muslims of equal access to the law. A butcher would no longer be able to enforce his contract for halal meat. Contracts that, like deals for kosher or other faith-sanctioned foods, are regularly enforced around the country. Nor could a Muslim banker seek damages for violations of a financial instrument certified as Sharia compliant because it pays no interest. The Oklahoma controversy gave rise to a wave of anti-Muslim sentiment across the state and also prompted other states to draft similar measures with an attempt to find language that avoids the constitutional problems found in the Oklahoma law. Perhaps strangest is a proposed law in Tennessee that would make following Sharia a felony, punishable by 15 years in jail. Since Sharia, like traditional Jewish law, covers a wide range of personal conduct, such as abstention from alcohol, dietary guidelines, rules for prayer, and a code of honesty in business dealings, it's quite absurd as written, but the very fact that it could be seriously proposed gives evidence of a high level of public ignorance and suspicion. When such objections were mentioned to the lawmaker, he replied, "I'm still researching it." Well, what does political philosophy have to say about these developments? As it turns out, a long philosophical and legal tradition has reflected about similar matters. Let's start with an assumption that's widely shared, that all human beings are equal bearers of human dignity. It's widely agreed that government must treat that dignity with equal respect. But what is it to treat people with equal respect in areas touching on religious belief and observance? We now add a further premise that the faculty with which people search for life's ultimate meaning, frequently called conscience, is a very important part of people, closely related to their human dignity. And we add one further premise, which I might call the vulnerability premise. This faculty can be seriously impeded by bad worldly conditions. It can be stopped from becoming active, and it can be even violated somehow within. The first sort of damage, which 17th century American thinker Roger Williams compared to imprisonment, happens when people are prevented from outward observances required by their religious beliefs. The second sort, which Williams very graphically called soul rape, occurs when people are forced to affirm convictions that they don't really hold or to give assent to orthodoxies that they don't support. The vulnerability premise shows us that giving equal respect to conscience requires tailoring worldly conditions so as to protect both freedom of belief and freedom of expression or practice. It suggests that freedom should be quite ample. If we now combine it with the equality premise, we get the principle that liberty should be both ample and equal. A principle very like John Rawls's idea that justice requires what he called, quote, the maximum liberty that is compatible with a like liberty for all. So, in accordance with that general idea, the framers of the US Constitution concluded that protecting the rights of conscience requires free exercise for all, and they were clearly concerned as well with equality, although that language does not appear in the Constitution as such. The state constitutions of the time made it clear that the commitment was to ample liberty, not just equal liberty, for they permitted only a few extremely urgent public considerations, particularly those of peace and safety, to trump the religious claim. But what do these abstract principles really mean? What is truly equal liberty in religious matters? And what limits might reasonably be placed on religious activities in a pluralistic society compatible with that commitment? The philosophical architects of the Anglo-American legal tradition could easily see that when peace and safety are at stake, or the equal rights of others, some reasonable limits might be imposed on what people do in the name of religion, and that such restrictions, supported by urgent public concerns, might still be compatible with a regime of equal liberty. But they grasped after a deeper and more principled rationale for these limits and protections. Here the philosophical tradition splits. One strand, associated with 17th century English philosopher John Locke, holds that protecting equal liberty of conscience requires only two things: laws that do not penalize religious belief, and laws that are non-discriminatory or non-persecutory about practices, applying the same laws to everyone in matters touching on religious activity. An example of a persecutory law, said Locke, was a law in England that makes it illegal to speak Latin in a church, but allows you to speak Latin in schools and universities. Now, obviously, he said the point of such a law is to persecute Roman Catholics. But if a law is not persecutory in this way, it may stand, even though it incidentally imposes burdens on some religious activities more than on others. If people find that their conscience will not permit them to obey a certain law regarding military service, say, or work days, they had better follow their conscience, says Locke, but then they will also have to pay the legal penalty. A modern Lockean case decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1993 concerned an ordinance passed by the city of Hialeah, Florida, which made ritual animal sacrifice illegal, but permitted the usual ways of killing animals for food. The court, invalidating the law, reasoned that it was a deliberate form of persecution directed at Santeria worshippers. Another tradition associated with Roger Williams, who was the founder of the colony of Rhode Island and copious writer, I think very good philosopher about religious freedom, holds that protection for conscience must be even stronger than this. This tradition reasons that laws in a democracy are always made by majorities, and they will naturally embody majority ideas of convenience. Even if such laws are not persecutory in their intent, they may turn out to be very unfair to minorities. In cases in which such laws burden the liberty of conscience, for example, by requiring people to testify in court on their holy day, or to perform military service that their religion forbids, or to abstain from the use of a drug required in their sacred ceremony, this tradition held that a special exemption, called an accommodation, should be given to the minority believer. On the whole, I would say, nothing in this area lacks controversy. The accommodationist position has been dominant in US law and public culture ever since George Washington wrote a famous letter to the Quakers explaining that he would not require them to serve in the military because the, quote, conscientious scruples of all men, end quote, deserve the greatest, quote, delicacy and tenderness, end quote. For a time, modern constitutional law in the US applied an accommodationist standard, holding the government may not impose a substantial burden on a person's free exercise of religion without a compelling state interest, of which peace and safety were obvious examples, but not the only ones. The landmark case articulating this principle concerned a woman who was a Seventh-day Adventist and whose workplace introduced a sixth workday, which was, of course, Saturday. Fired because she refused to work on that day, she sought unemployment compensation from the state of South Carolina and was denied on the grounds that she had refused suitable work. The US Supreme Court ruled in her favor, arguing that the denial of benefits was like fining Mrs. Sherbert for her non-standard religious practices. It was thus a denial of her equal freedom to worship in her own way. There was nothing wrong in principle with choosing Sunday as the day of rest and Saturday as a work day, but then there was something wrong with not accommodating Mrs. Sherbert's religious needs. I believe, and I've argued elsewhere, that the accommodationist principle is more adequate than Locke's principle because it reaches subtle forms of discrimination that are ubiquitous in majoritarian democratic life. All societies make choices regarding holidays, workdays, drug and alcohol restrictions, and a host of other matters that touch on people's religious observances. The choices of a majority are usually supported by some type of reasoning, but they may be extremely harsh to minorities, rendering their liberty unequal. To grant accommodations on grounds of conscience in areas ranging from employment to military conscription to sacramental alcohol or drug use is to restore a, sort of right the balance, restore a standard of equal liberty. Accommodation has problems, however. One, which was emphasized by Justice Scalia when he turned our constitutional jurisprudence toward the Lockean standard in 1990, is that a system based on individualized exemptions is difficult for judges to administer. Creating exemptions to general laws on a case-by-case basis struck Scalia as too chaotic and beyond the competence of the judiciary. Thus, though he thought that accommodations created by legislation would be permissible, such as the change in our Controlled Substances Act that later legalized the sacramental use of peyote, which is what was at stake in the case he was arguing with, he was opposed to granting such exemptions case by case and judicially. Another problem faced by the accommodationist position is that it has typically favored religion and disfavored other reasons people may have for seeking an exemption to general laws. Family reasons, for example, reasons having to do with personal commitments to art, or even to a secular ethical creed. To some extent, it's possible to deal with these other commitments in other areas of law, through a capacious free speech principle, for example, and through laws protecting family leave. But not all problems can be handled in this way, and some scholars think this is sufficient reason to deny accommodations for all, thus reverting to the Lockean position. If the system of accommodation can't be fair to everyone, it shouldn't exist. They thus revert to a position that is both less ample and less equal in regard to religious liberty, but on grounds that are not without merit. So, the Williams position has not yet shown that it can defeat the Lockean position. This is a thorny issue that requires lengthy discussion, but in fact, we don't need it here because the recent European cases all involve discriminatory laws that fail to pass even the weaker Lockean test. Although in the special case of the French law, this will take some time to show. So now I'm going to try to show that these European laws don't pass the test of neutrality. And I'm going to focus on the burka. Arguments made there can be adapted to other cases. And then finally, I'll turn to the special case of French secularism. What I'm now going to argue is that the 5 most prominent arguments in favor of banning the burka are made inconsistently in ways that tacitly favor majority practices and burden minority practices. So they're thus not compatible with a regime of equal liberty, and in turn, not compatible with the idea of equal respect for conscience from which that principle springs. Indeed, we could say that all are cases of seeing the mote in your brother's eye while failing to appreciate the large plank that is in your own eye. For all target situations alleged to be present in Muslim communities while failing to note their ubiquity in the majority culture. So let's look at each argument in turn, asking whether it treats citizens with equal respect. First is an argument from security. It holds that security requires people to show their face when appearing in public space. A second closely related argument, which I'll treat together with it, is an argument from transparency. It says the kind of transparency and reciprocity proper to relations between citizens is impeded by covering most of the face. What's wrong with both of these arguments is that they're applied inconsistently. It gets very cold in Chicago. We walk along the streets, hats pulled down over ears and brows, scarves wound tightly around noses and mouths, being sunglasses to impede the wind. No problem of either transparency or security is thought to exist, nor are we forbidden to enter public buildings so insulated. Moreover, many beloved and trusted professionals cover their faces all year round. Surgeons, dentists, American football players, skiers, and skaters. The latter typically wear a full face covering with slits only for the eyes, similar to, indeed, a niqab. Some are even more covered, therefore, than the typical burqa wearer. My endodontist, the guy who performs that dread procedure known as the root canal, hope you haven't experienced that, but many of you have, I'm sure, needing an extremely accurate view of a very small space, wears not only the face mask that most dentists, all dentists wear, but in addition a form of very elaborate headgear that covers his eyes totally with a type of magnifying lens that magnifies from his point of view, but of course makes it impossible for me to see his eyes at all. But of course, no one would want him to take that off because it's bad enough having a root canal, but certainly not by somebody who can't really see what he's doing. So, in general then, what inspires fear and mistrust in Europe, and to some extent in the US, is not facial covering per se. It's Muslim facial covering. But it will be said we're living in an era of terrorism. And in the war against terror, it's legitimate to suspect women wearing a burqa. This is a widespread view in the US and I think probably in Europe as well. All I can say is that if I were a terrorist in the US or Europe, and if I were not stupid, the last thing I would wear would be a burqa. Since that way of dressing attracts suspicious attention. Criminals usually want not to attract suspicious attention, and if they're at all intelligent, they succeed. I think I dress like Martha Nussbaum in the winter. Floor-length Eddie Bauer down coat, hat down over the eyebrows, big, thick Indian shawl around the face, large sunglasses, and so on. Extra hood, maybe for insulation. That's something I sometimes do. Nonetheless, I've never been asked to remove these clothes in a department store, a public building, or even a bank. In the summer, again, if I were the intelligent sort of terrorist, I would wear a big floppy hat and a long, loose caftan, and I'd carry a capacious Louis Vuitton bag, the sort that signals conspicuous consumption. That's what a smart terrorist would do, and those are the ones who want to worry about it. So what to do about the threat that all bulky and non-revealing clothing creates? Airline security, of course, has figured that out with metal detectors, body imaging, and pat-downs, and so on. One system I like is the system in India where all passengers get a full manual pat-down, but in a curtained booth by someone of the same sex who is obviously trained to be courteous and respectful, which Americans are not so trained. But anyway, that is a good system, I think. Private stores or other organizations who feel that bulky clothing is a threat, whether of shoplifting or terrorism or both, could institute a non-discriminatory rule banning, for example, floor-length coats. They could even have a body scanner at the door. But they don't, preferring customer friendliness to the extra margin of safety. What I want to establish, however, is the invidious discrimination inherent in the belief that a burqa poses a unique security risk. Reasonable security policies applied to similar cases similarly are perfectly fine. A reasonable demand would be that a Muslim woman have a full face photo on her driver's license or passport. With suitable protection for modesty during the photographic session, such a photo could be required, and I don't think this would be incompatible with equal liberty. Moreover, I have been informed by Muslim scholars that have written to me that most contemporary Islamic scholars agree. At immigration checkpoints, however, we're beginning to discover that the face is a very bad identifier. Eye recognition and fingerprinting are already replacing the photo. When these superior technologies spread to police and airport security lines, we will be able to do away with the photo, hence with what remains of the first argument. Sometimes people argue that even if a burqa ban would be both over-inclusive, that is, banning clothing worn by harmless people, and under-inclusive, failing to ban many forms of attire that terrorists might choose, still, it's a good proxy for what's truly dangerous, and that this sort of profiling is perfectly legitimate. We can certainly debate the empirics here, and we should, but what about that kind of principle? Let's consider a relevant parallel. Chicago's short-lived gang congregation ordinance, which prohibited criminal street gang members from loitering in public places. Under this law, if a police officer, quote, reasonably believes, end quote, that a person loitering in a public space, and loitering was defined as being there without apparent purpose, is a gang member, he can order both that person and other people with whom he is loitering to disperse. Anyone who does not promptly obey has violated the ordinance. Suppose, for example, that blue and black are the colors associated with a particular gang, and that was in fact the case. I mean, so this is a true example. This was Jesus Morales was the plaintiff in this case, and that was his gang. So, if a teenage boy wearing blue and black is hanging out with a group of his friends, all are subject to the ordinance and may end up being both jailed and fined. The US Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional on due process grounds, saying it was both impermissibly vague and an arbitrary restriction of personal liberty. The ordinance was both under and over-inclusive in much the same way as the ban on the burqa. It burdened a huge amount of harmless conduct, wearing blue or black, and it failed to target a lot of harmful conduct, such as gang activity by people smart enough not to wear gang colors. Like the burqa ban, again, it led to objectionable ethnic profiling. If I were to wear a blue dress with a black handbag, no police officer would look twice at me, even if I was loitering without apparent purpose, whatever that means. Only young men would be targeted, and for the most part, only African American or Hispanic young men. The burqa ban does somewhat better on the vagueness criterion. It's pretty clear what's legal and what's illegal, but on the count of arbitrary restriction of personal liberty, it does no better. Indeed, it very likely does worse, since there actually is strong evidence of a correlation between gangs hanging around in a place and crime in that place. So there was a real problem they were trying to get at, but the proposed bans of the burqa are not supported by any similar correlation between the presence of Muslim women in a public place and crime in that place. Once we add that the liberty in question is religious liberty, which usually gets more stringent protection than mere personal taste in clothing, the case against the burqa ban looks easier to make than the case against Chicago's law. We still need to say more about the variant of this argument that I've called the transparency argument. I've already begun to reply by pointing to the many contexts in civic life in which we do make human contact with our fellow citizens when the face is to some extent covered. But we can now add two further points. The first is that long-standing traditions in many cultures hold that the eyes are the windows of the soul. Contact with another person as individual to individual is made more through eyes than through nose or mouth. Once, during a construction project that involved a lot of dust in my office, I decided to cover everything but my eyes while talking to students for a longish number of weeks. At first, they did find it pretty weird, but soon they were asking me how they could get a mask and filter scarf like the ones that I was using. My personality was not stifled, nor did they feel that they could not access my individuality. To be sure, some versions of the niqab do cover the eyes to some extent, but no more than is the case with sunglasses. And we usually don't find ourselves unable to have a conversation with someone wearing sunglasses. The further point that I would make is that people often have difficulty talking to people who look strange. And there's an unfortunate human tendency to blame this difficulty on the person who looks unusual rather than on oneself. People with facial deformities are hugely stigmatized in most cultures. People with both mental and physical disabilities are often excluded from conversation. Indeed, children with disabilities used to be hidden away in a special room, not integrated into mainstream classrooms, partly on the ground, and this was even said in congressional testimony, that so-called normal children found it unpleasant to interact with them. Nowadays, people with these disabilities are integrated, and an instructor in a university classroom, to choose just one example, knows that she can't exclude a person with major disabilities such as blindness or Tourette's syndrome, because those things are accepted categories for toleration and inclusion. So if she finds it hard to talk to such a student, she will blame that not on the student but on herself, and she will try to do her job better. I think that talking to someone wearing a burqa is about as difficult for the unhabituated as talking to someone who is blind, and less difficult than talking to someone with mental illness. All too often, however, the difficulty is still blamed on the woman wearing the burqa rather than on oneself. And I should add, too, that in the case of blindness, we've learned very quickly with the integration of such people that human contact is made through the voice and doesn't need even a facial, face-to-face contact at all. A third argument, very prominent today, is that the burqa is a symbol of male domination that symbolizes the objectification of women. It encourages people to think of and to treat women as a mere object. A Catalonian legislator recently called the burqa a degrading prison. This is a serious point, say about the argument is that people who make it typically don't know very much about Islam and would have a hard time saying what symbolizes what in that religion. But the more glaring problem in the argument, and this is, I've written about the objectification of women for decades, right, is that society is suffused with symbols of male supremacy that we might well argue objectify women. Sex magazines, pornography, nude photos, tight jeans, transparent or revealing clothing, all of these products, arguably, and that is indeed what the feminist literature on objectification is about, treat women as objects for male consumption, as do many aspects of our media culture. Women are encouraged to market themselves for male objectification in this way, and it has long been contended that this is a way of robbing women of both agency and individuality, reducing them to objects or commodities. And what about the degrading prison of plastic surgery? Every time I undress in the locker room of my gym, I see women bearing the scars of liposuction, tummy tucks, breast implants. Isn't a lot of this, anyway, done in order to conform to a male norm of female beauty that casts women as sex objects? If the proposal were to ban all practices concerning which a Ministry of Feminism had concluded that they objectify women, then the proposal would at least be consistent, although few, and I think probably today no feminist at all, would endorse such a sweeping restriction of liberty or the authority it would vest in a small number of alleged experts. But it's, of course, not made consistently. Proponents of the burqa ban do not propose to ban all these objectifying practices. Indeed, they often enjoy them. I've had this argument made by Spanish women wearing very revealing clothing and 5-inch heel. You know, it's very comical in a sense. But so once again, then, the opponents of the burqa are utterly inconsistent, betraying a fear of the different that is discriminatory and unworthy of a liberal democracy. In effect, they're arrogating to themselves the position of the inquisitorial ministry of feminism, a point that was very nicely made by Joan Scott in her book on the headscarf. And, but only for certain people whose real motives and understanding they're particularly likely not to understand clearly. But the way to deal with sexism, in this case, isn't all, is by persuasion and example, not by removing liberty. Of course, things that are legal can still be disapproved of. What I'm arguing is that equal respect requires equal conditions of liberty. It doesn't require equal personal approval of all religious practices or any other of the practices I've just mentioned. Legality is not approval. Many things are legal that most of us would consider deplorable. Unkindness, stinginess, incivility, narcissism. And in a society based on equal respect for persons, people with one religious or secular view remain perfectly free to disapprove of some religious practices or even of all of them and of religion itself. Still, such a person ought to at least think about consistency. And I think a duty of civility suggests that she ought at least to try hard to understand. One should listen to what women who wear the burqa say they think it means before opining. And in general, I think one should just hesitate before offering one's view of the intimate aspects of other people's lives. Not something Americans are very good at, however. A fourth argument holds that women wear the burqa only because they are coerced. Now this is, I think, an implausible argument to make across the board, and it's typically made by people who have no idea what the circumstances of this or that individual woman are. But we should reply that, of course, all forms of violence, physical coercion in the home are illegal already, and laws against domestic violence and abuse should be enforced much more zealously than they are. Do the arguers really believe that domestic violence in the US and Europe is a peculiarly Muslim problem? If they do not seem to be right. According to the US Bureau of Justice Statistics, intimate partner violence made up 20% of all non-fatal violent crime experienced by women in the year 2001. The National Violence Against Women Survey, which is again cited on the DJS website, reported that 52% of surveyed women said they were physically assaulted as a child by an adult caretaker and or as an adult by any type of perpetrator. There's no good evidence on the Muslim minority because it's just the numbers are too small, but given the strong association between domestic violence and the abuse of alcohol, which we do know quite well about, it seems at least plausible that observant Muslim families might turn out to have less of it. Suppose there were evidence that the burqa ban was associated strongly statistically with violence against women, that the burqa was associated statistically with violence against women. Could government legitimately ban it on those grounds? The US Supreme Court did hold that nude dancing may be banned on account of its contingent association with crime, including crimes against women. But this was a very strange opinion written by Justice Souter, and I think it's not clear that he had really the empirical evidence to back up what he said. But he was talking about the difference between complete nudity and wearing pasties and a G-string. And so it seemed a little bit implausible to suppose that that difference was meant the difference between a lot of crime and a lot less crime. But anyway, arguments corrected really very well. College fraternities are strongly associated with violence against women, and some universities have made all or some fraternities move off campus as a result, but private institutions are entitled to make such regulations about what can occur on their premises. Public universities, like this one, are entitled to limit the type of activities that will get public money, particularly when they involve illegality, underage drinking. But a total governmental ban on the male drinking club or other places where men get drunk, such as soccer matches, would certainly be a bizarre restriction of associational liberty. Moreover, even during Prohibition, religions that required the sacramental use of alcohol got an exemption. Similarly, federal law today exempts the religious use of alcohol from the drinking age. So the correct analog would be a ban on the burqa that exempted those who wear it for religious reasons, which is to say, of course, virtually all users. What's most important, however, is that anyone proposing to ban the burqa must consider it, together with these other cases, weigh the evidence, and take the consequences for their own cherished hobbies. But what about children and adolescents? Surely they don't have much choice as long as they're living with their parents. So family pressure to wear religious dress is likely to be difficult to resist. This question opens up a huge topic, since there's nothing that's more common in the modern family than various forms of coercive pressure to get into a top college, to date people of the right religion or ethnicity, to wear appropriate clothes, to choose a remunerative career and major, to take a shower, and so on. So, where should government and law step in? Certainly, it should step in wherever physical or sexual abuse is going on, which is very often. Where religious mandates are concerned, intervention would be justified. Similarly, where the behavior either constitutes a gross risk to bodily health and safety, as with Jehovah's Witness children being forbidden to have a life-saving blood transfusion, or impairs some major functioning. Thus, I think that female genital mutilation practiced on minors should be illegal if it's a form that impairs sexual pleasure or other bodily functions. A symbolic prick is a different story. The Christian Science belief that children should not be taken to the doctor when they're ill has also been litigated successfully. And some forms of alternative medical treatment have led to abuse and neglect convictions. In every case, what's really going on is my two-sided balancing test. Is there a burden on the parent's religious freedom? And if so, does a strong state interest justify the imposition of this burden? Now to the burqa. The burqa for minors is not in the same class as genital mutilation, since it is not irreversible and does not endanger health or impair other bodily functions. If it's imposed by physical or sexual violence, then that violence should be legally punished. Otherwise, however, it seems to be in the same category as all kinds of requirements parents impose on their children. Some practices of this type do appear to violate laws against child cruelty. Thus, when Yale law professor Amy Chua, in this popular book about the tiger mother, admitted that she had forced her daughter to stand outside in the cold without supper, and on another occasion forced her to stay at the piano without bathroom access or dinner because she hadn't mastered a difficult passage in a piano work, one did wonder why the police were not on her doorstep. And of course, the answer is immediate. She's a rich Yale law professor. That sounds to me like child abuse. If similar coercive tactics were used to get a child to wear a burqa, then the case would be open to intervention. But most cases are not like this. They're much harder. I mean, my father, for example, threatened to disinherit me and not pay for my college education if I appeared in public in a group, any member of which was an African American. Now that was really very bad. But should the police have come in and removed custody from him? I don't really think so. I think the better thing the government did was to give me access to a very good education that enabled me to get out of there, meet the wrong sort of people. So I think societies are entitled to insist that all female children have a decent education and employment opportunities that give them exit options from any home situation they may dislike. If people think that women only wear the burqa because of coercive pressure, well, let them create ample opportunities for women and then see what they actually do. Before we leave the topic of coercion, however, there's a reasonable point to be made in this connection. When Turkey banned the veil long ago, there was a good reason in that specific context, because women who went unveiled were being subjected to harassment and violence. The ban protected a space for the choice to be unveiled and was legitimate so long as women did not have that choice. We might think of this as a substantial burden justified temporarily by a compelling state interest. The ban, I think, is not any longer justified today, where women can circulate freely unveiled, nor certainly would it be justified in today's Europe or the US, where women can certainly dress as they like. There's no reason for the burden to religious liberty in that context. One thing Americans and Europeans need to face squarely is the fact that some people actually choose lives involving authority and constraint. Given that the US and most European nations have had volunteer armies for some time, and that Germany just dropped its own conscription law, all citizens of these countries have reason to be grateful for the fact that the preference for a structured life submissive to authority, maybe not in all instances, as our recent, my comrade on that list, David Petraeus, shows, runs strong in their societies. And most do treat the choices of the men and women of the military respectfully. So, should they then demonize some lives that involve submission to authority and extol others? I think they shouldn't, unless they can find a relevant difference. That the US is worth the sacrifice of autonomy, but religion is not. Many people believe this, but it seems nosy and rude to make such judgments about strangers. Finally, one often hears the argument that the burqa is per se unhealthy because it's hot and uncomfortable. I've heard this argument very often in Europe, and particularly in Spain for some reason. Now, I think this is perhaps the silliest of the arguments. Clothing that covers the body can be comfortable or uncomfortable depending on the fabric. As people in India know, full-body clothing made of breathable cotton or light silk is a very good choice in the heat because it's superbly comfortable and full covering keeps dust off the limbs and at least diminishes the risk of skin cancer. It's surely far from clear that the amount of skin displayed in typical Spanish female dress would meet with a dermatologist's approval. And I say this feelingly as a runner who now at this point in my life have to be checked by a dermatologist every 6 months of possible skin cancer. So, you know, this is a health issue. But more pointedly, would the arguer really seek to ban all uncomfortable and possibly unhealthy female clothing? Wouldn't we have to begin with high heels and platform shoes, delicious as they are, and I certainly do love them. But of course that's not mentioned in these European debates. In general, the state limits its regulatory interventions into clothing to making sure that clothing sold for children is flame-proof and without harmful chemicals, and other gross health risks are avoided. But on the whole, women in particular are allowed and even encouraged to wear clothing that could plausibly be argued to create some health risk, whether a tendon shortening or some kind of skin problem through exposure to the sun. All 5 arguments are discriminatory in much the same way that Locke's argument, the law he talked about Latin, was discriminatory. We don't even need to reach the delicate issue of religious accommodation to see that they are unacceptable in a society committed to equal liberty. Equal respect for conscience requires us to reject them. But let's, before we conclude, consider the special case of France. Unlike other European nations, France is consistent up to a point. Given its history of anti-clericalism and the strong commitment to laïcité, religion is not to set its mark on public space, and the public realm is permitted to disfavor religion by contrast to non-religion. This commitment leads to restrictions on a wide range of religious manifestations, all in the name of a total separation of church and state. But if one looks closely, the restrictions are, after all, discriminatory. The school dress code forbids the Muslim headscarf and the Jewish yarmulke, along with large Christian crosses. But this is a totally unequal burden, because the first two items of clothing are religiously obligatory for at least some members of those religions, and the third is not. Christians are under no religious obligation to wear any cross, much less a large one. Would French secularism be acceptable if practiced in an even-handed way? According to US constitutional law, government may not favor religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. For example, it was unconstitutional for the University of Virginia to announce that it would use the student fees to fund all other student organizations, political, cultural, environmental, and so on, but not the religious clubs. This is a 1995 case, Rosenberger versus Rector and Visitors of the University of Virginia. I must say, I prefer the balanced policy that ensued to French laïcité. I think it's fairer to religious people. Separation is not total, even in France. Thus, a fire in a burning church would still be put out by the public fire department. Churches still get the use of the public water supply and the public sewer system. Still, the amount and type of separation that the French system mandates, while understandable historically, looks unfair in the light of the principles that I've defended. But let's now consider the language of the law that bans the burqa. It prohibits, quote, wearing attire designed to hide the face, porter une tenue destinée à dissimuler son visage, and then there's a long list of exceptions, which I'll just read in English. The prohibition described in Article 1 does not apply if the attire is prescribed or authorized by legislative or regulatory dispensation, if it is justified for reasons of health or professional motives, or if it is adopted in the context of athletic practices, festivals, or artistic or traditional manifestation, performances. One's first reaction to this capacious list is that they've tried to include every possible occasion for covering the face except the burqa. Certainly, if we go down my list of parallel cases, we find that most are dealt with. Skaters and skiers by sport, doctors and dentists by professional requirements, my office face mask by health, and a variety of other theatrical uses of the mask by aesthetic and traditional manifestation. I'm not sure what becomes of me in Chicago in the winter, but I'd be willing to bet that I'd get an exemption on grounds of health. Clearly, though, you don't purchase principle consistency by simply listing as an exception to your principle everything except the one thing you really dislike. The French have a reply to make, however, for they do not exempt any religious occasion or motive for covering the face. In the case of the school dress code, they did, and those small crosses showed favoritism to the Christian majority. From the point of view of our principle of equal liberty, of course, the whole policy of laïcité is problematic, since it privileges non-religion over religion and constricts the liberty of religious expression without any compelling government interest. But we're not asking that question at this point. We're just asking about fairness among the religions. Does the application of the ban to all religion mean that the ban, unlike the school dress code, is truly neutral? Oh, of course, although the word burqa does not occur in the legislation, we understand perfectly well that that's what it's really aiming at. And the fact that they're so generous with other cultural and professional exemptions shows that they're not really worried about the practice as such, only when it's a religious manifestation. But still, isn't that a consistent and up to a point neutral application of laïcité? The difficulty we have here is that no other religion has a custom of precisely that sort. So what the law has done is to single out something that's of central importance to some members of one religion and to apply a very heavy burden to it, no public space at all, without similarly burdening the central and cherished practices of other religions. Indeed, it seems clear that one would have no problem if one were to make the sign of the cross over oneself in a public park, if one were to sing a religious hymn loud as one walked down the Champs-Élysées, or if one were to wear any type of religious apparel other than the burka, cassocks, nuns' habits, Hasidic dress, the saffron garb of the Hindu priest, all of these remain unburdened. So it's neutral in one way, but not at all neutral in another. At this point, defenders of the ban will typically allude to one of the other arguments, saying that the burqa, unlike these forms of clothing, is a security risk, is an impediment to transparency, etc. But the fact that the government doesn't really credit these rationales is clear from the fact that they permit so many exceptions to the ban. Even a public masquerade in which hundreds of people cover their faces receives explicit defense in the statute. So it's clear that the government doesn't think that security provides a compelling interest in favor of the total ban. It's trumped routinely by weak and even frivolous interests. So I conclude that the French ban is not truly neutral any more than the school dress code. Besides the obvious objection that French secularism does not allow sufficiently ample freedom for religious observance, we may add the objection of bias. Philosophical principles shape constitutional traditions and the texture of public culture. I tried to articulate some important principles behind traditions of religious liberty and equality in both the US and Europe. Today, a climate of fear and suspicion directed primarily against Muslims threatens to derail these admirable commitments. But if we articulate them clearly and see the reasons for them, this may help us to oppose these ominous developments. Good principles will not help, however, unless we continually examine ourselves as Socrates demanded. And that, I think, means a kind of continual philosophical critique of culture. And one thing more is needed to combat the kind of selfishness and special privileging of oneself that I've been criticizing, a cultivation of the sympathetic imagination, so that we become able to see the world through the eyes of those who look strange to us. Consistency by itself, and I might even say philosophy all by itself without the other humanities, is a merely formalistic demand, and we can't pursue it well unless we're first able to see others as fully human. This ability is based on some innate human capacities, probably, but it needs to be developed by liberal education in history, literature, religious studies. So, although this has been primarily a philosophical lecture and the humanities as a whole are a topic for another hour, those disciplines, I think, along with philosophy, are necessary for a truly pluralistic society. Thanks.
So I will try to be moderator, and we have requested that the first three questions come from students, graduate, undergraduate, so Eva,
I just want to say thank you.
Maybe you should stand up, because it would be good for everyone to hear you. I'm not sure how your business is working. Yeah.
Okay, so I agree with everything you said, and you talked about cultivation of sympathetic imagination. But I wanted to bring up an example. Every time I fly with my mum, if we're flying through a distant harbour, she'd say, okay, we're in this certain country, I want you to cover up. And then as soon as we get to Switzerland, she'll say, you know, wear whatever you want, we're in the West. Isn't it fair to say that when people are in Rome, they should do as the Romans do?
It's a very tough question, I think. So her question is, her mother routinely tells her, you're now in Ethiopia, cover up. You're now in Switzerland, you can wear what you like. Is it right that we should do as the Romans do? I think we should figure out how to balance our own sense of our equality and dignity against the idea that we should be courteous and show respect for others. And it's not always so easy. I mean, I think in those cases it seems fine to do it, but see, I myself would not, for example, go to Iran where I would have to cover totally and sit in the back of the bus and other restrictions. I think I just don't go there. Now, when I'm in India, I do try, on certain kinds of occasions, I try to wear what seems respectful. I wouldn't wear a mini skirt. I probably would cover my legs and so on. When I go running, I guess I used to wear long tights at all times, but then I just decided, this is ridiculous, it's hot, I don't feel like wearing long tights, and so now I don't. I mean, because in any case, a woman running is so weird. And so little school children would follow me and say, ha, ha, ha. And so, but, I think it's just something that you have to sort out, and it is tricky. One way I solve it is that I am interested in fashion, so I just try to go shopping in the place and get whatever a woman would really look good in that place, and then it becomes a non-issue. But yeah, I don't think there's a single answer to it, and I think you do have to think, does this feel demeaning to me, in which case I shouldn't do it, or maybe I'll just avoid that place or whatever, because you can't turn yourself on and off the way somebody who's raised in that culture might not seem demeaning to them. But yeah, so in short, I just think it is very, very tricky. Now, I mean, I even encounter it in this country in lots of ways, because I'm a Reform Jew, and we can pretty much wear anything in temple, but I have to remember that that's not true in all temples, and that if I were to wear something sleeveless, or certainly something backless I couldn't even wear in my own temple if I'm officiating in any way. And when I go to lecture at Brigham Young, I have to remember that something sleeveless is regarded as extremely shocking. I didn't know that one time. And then I got a big surprise when people said, oh, it was a real shock moment when you took off your jacket. So I think in those cases, if you don't, it doesn't matter to me whether I have something sleeveless or not. It doesn't feel like inhibiting my selfhood or my individuality that I should have a jacket or sleeves or whatever. Then I would go with the courtesy and do as the Romans do. But if it does feel to you demeaning and inhibiting your individuality, well, you're not a member of that culture. You don't have to wrestle with that. So then I think you just have more freedom of choice. But it is tricky.
Other students? Yes, please.
You proposed a way to judge, I guess, the acceptability of different actions, but do you think we should change the tolerance that we show to people who are unwilling to follow this sort of equilibrium of tolerance, and especially if that in some way impairs the liberties of somebody else?
Well, I think it depends what they do. I mean, if they are trying to violate people's rights in any forcible way, either by physical violence of some kind or by introducing proposed laws like the ones I discussed, then I think we have a duty to stop them, because it is very, very bad. And when, of course, a whole community is troubled by this, like DuPage County in Chicago has this constant attempt to circumvent toleration by proposing some specious reason for not allowing the building of a mosque. They say, oh, too much traffic is caused by religious institutions. And then I think, again, we have a duty to unmask that and to get out there and to try to create zones of equal liberty for people. If people are just being rude, well, people are rude in all kinds of ways. I mean, pregnant women know that people are always going to come up to you on the street and give you advice about your pregnancy, your children. If you have children, they're going to also give you advice about what you're doing with your children. So I think I would put nosiness and rudeness all in one large category and just think, if people are rude, you just have to find some way of turning that off and just not paying attention. And I think public criticism by others, by third parties, is a very good thing. And of course, the advice columns are full of that. If you read advice columns, that's what they spend a lot of their time in, is just telling people, don't be nosy and rude, or if you encounter that, here are some smart things you can say to reflect that. So I think that's, but you know, I think what really, really helps in this respect, and it's very much a part of the current undergraduate culture, so I hope it is here, is just a lot of discussion in groups that include students of many different kinds. I mean, just to take one example that's on my mind in a particular case, transgender students, of course, used to be pilloried, bullied, life was made intolerable for them. How is this changing? It's changing because the undergraduate environment has lots of discussion where they hear these people's stories, they learn what would be respectful and what those people think of as respectful. The institution backs that up, and so on. So I think the institution has to also send the signal, and then the discussion groups can deal with some of the rest of that. In the case of sexism of all kinds, which of course is a huge feature of campus life everywhere, and we're only just the tip of the iceberg coming out with all the instances of unreported, unadjudicated rape at Amherst College and all these other places. I ask my students when I teach feminist philosophy, you know, what would happen if, let's say, men in our law school put up signs of the sort that had been recently put up at Yale, which were obscene insults to women. The interesting thing that they said to me last year, which made me very happy, is on the first day of our registration as 1Ls, the dean of students, Dean Gardner, talked to us about civility and what kind of discourse makes for a healthy law student community. And so we feel that we would go up to those guys who put up that poster and tell them, remind them of what Dean Gardner had said, and say, that's not really acceptable here. It's not creating a climate of civility. And she, you know, this woman felt that they would definitely listen and take the posters down. And I thought that's really great when the administration sends clear enough signals without impinging on freedom of speech. It's just an agreement that civility has tougher requirements than the First Amendment.
Yes, please, in the race.
You touched on like transgender community. I was just wondering if you had like any other insights into like the symbolism of tolerance in higher education.
Well, you know, I think it's actually, I don't know that it's special in higher education. I think maybe higher education has an advantage in that they can take steps to combat it by, what I favor in the undergraduate curriculum is that everyone should have some knowledge of the major world religions and should really learn about them in a subtle, sophisticated, historical way. They should have been doing that in school too, but often they don't. But at any rate, they can do it with new sophistication and new rigor, and then they should be having these conversations. So I think we're lucky in the sense that we have more opportunities for this kind of intervention through learning and conversation, but it isn't that we're at all free of that. I think there's plenty of, I mean, I just talked on this topic at Hamilton College, and I found in the audience was a Muslim woman who had just arrived. She was a freshman there, and she felt very uncomfortable. I mean, it wasn't exactly that she'd been treated badly, but she just didn't know how she would be treated. It was so early, and she didn't know how to talk to people. She says, what do you advise me to do? And should I didn't wear my headscarf because I thought I might be teased and bullied, but maybe I should, and maybe I should just explain it to me, but I don't really want to explain myself all the time. You know, so I think that we have that kind of problem all the time, and it would be a lot easier if people knew more. She didn't have to anticipate ignorance and hostility. And I think this is what's happening gradually but surely with sexual orientation and transgender. But with religion, it's more spotty because you have to actually understand something about countries other than your own, and you know, it requires more teaching in that sense. And yet, you know, it's long been the case in many parts of the country that any single Jew who might be in a public school class would have to explain what Judaism is. And that's, my dean of our law school, Mike Schill, said in Schenectady, New York, that's what he had to do every year, you know, give a little speech about what Judaism is. Well, that's, you know, it's better than nothing, but it's actually not so great for that kid to have to be the avatar of Judaism for all. So it'd be better if everyone didn't have to ask that question, if their education in their home and in their school had given them some basis for knowing what Judaism was. And of course, what Mike Schill knew well is that this ignorance was closely connected to a regime where there were Jewish law firms, which he then went into, and non-Jewish law firms, which would not let him go in. So I think, you know, just education for everyone.
Good question. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about kind of how the media polarizes this, I don't know, this idea of like us versus them. So a couple of months, I guess weeks ago, we had the whole like Muhammad video in the news, and the media kind of polarized it that the whole Arab world was like exploding in protest when it was really like less than 1%.
I know. I mean, the media do some good things. And I do think there was this wonderful reality TV series that no longer on, but you can still get it, I think, American Muslim, which was a wonderful exploration of Muslim families outside Detroit, showing their tremendous variety, different national origins, different attitudes to religion, you know, what you would expect, only people don't always know that. And one very moving part was about one rather observant Muslim woman married a man from an Irish family, and the man converted to Islam, and the Irish family was very upset, and how did they deal with this? And the wonderful end of it was a wedding where there was traditional Middle Eastern dancing, traditional Irish step dancing, and so it was very interesting and great. There's a lot that's not so interesting and great, and I think it's just unacceptable for people to equate Islam with extremist Islam, and of course, more generally, then to think that Islam is only in the Middle East or is primarily in the Middle East. I mean, really, how many people know that the largest, if you have to rank by population numbers, the number one Muslim population is Indonesia, the number two is India. And so we need to learn more about the different ways Muslims live in all parts of the world, as well as, of course, in America, where in my city, most Muslims are from Bangladesh or Pakistan or India. So, yeah, and I think the media then couldn't get away with scaring us in that particular way. They would have to adopt a much more subtle account. And I think it's also, the internet is full of bad stuff too. And in my book I talk about the blogger Pamela Geller, who was very much in conversation with Breivik, and probably he posted on her blog, although it can't be known for sure. And, you know, misinformation was spread through that blog, and people who spread misinformation on the internet and write crude books are even invited to lecture, sometimes for the FBI and the military. So we have to demand a much higher level of awareness and education on the part of government, on the part of the FBI and the CIA and the military, and of course then in the media. And that's one reason I started writing on this topic, and I wrote, you know, a blog for the New York Times, and I have a principle that I don't read blogs or write for blogs because I just find, for me, it's a drain on my time, and it's just too hard to get other stuff done. But I did make an exception in this one instance because I thought there's so much misinformation. And then when I got 700 comments, a lot of which took the form that you suggest because they had been influenced by these biased media accounts, then I thought, oh, well, there's a problem that's wider than I thought, because if even readers of the opinionator column in the New York Times are so full of this information and lack of argument, then probably I should spend a little longer addressing this issue. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. The media on sexual orientation have not been perfect, but they've been really quite marvelous in many respects. And certainly, if we had to ask how have attitudes on sexual orientation changed as rapidly as they have, shows like Will and Grace play a large part, because they show a variety of lives, they show love, friendship, but all with great grace and humor. If we had images of Muslims that were that good, and I think that one show did start in that direction, then we'd be a lot better off. But of course, such a large proportion of people in the media are gay or lesbian, and that's not, and they're not Muslims, so they're not doing it. So we ought to urge them in that direction.
John?
Yeah, thanks so much for your stimulating talk. I can't resist asking you a question about contemporary American tension here. It's too big a question, just forget it. But what do you think about the alleged war on religion, allegedly waged by the Obama government against the Catholic bishops? And I say bishops knowingly rather than the church, because I think the bishops are the only ones on earth not using contraception.
Yeah, well, and of course, the Catholic bishops in Britain have had a different policy. They've adopted what's called a pastoral solution, where you don't even have to confess contraceptive use in the confessional. So it's just the American Catholic bishops, and I think probably reflecting the large proportion of Irish Catholics with their more conservative attitudes. And of course, the attitude of Irish Catholics has many unique features, such as allowing that woman to die the other day. Did you see that? Well, anyway, so I won't go into that. It was a very terrible case of a woman who had a baby that was not going to live. It was clear. She was miscarrying. The fetus was going to die. They wanted to remove it surgically so she would be fine and not get infected, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't allow it. And then she eventually died after 4 days of having this dying fetus and such. Anyway, so yeah, I think the Obama administration's first policy, where they were just going to requirements of all of them, exempting Catholic hospitals but requiring the individual, that was probably a little too insensitive, and when they then took it back and retooled it in a more, I would say, accommodationist direction, that is, it was done through the insurance companies, and it was the individual who held the policy and the insurance companies who were really doing it, then I think that's accommodation enough, really, for religious individuals. And I don't think they should have been upset. At first they weren't upset because they felt they had gotten the concession, but then they decided somehow they were going to impose it anyway. So I think that it's right for them to make sure that all women have cost-free contraception. I think that was an extremely important move. Moreover, a move that all European countries long ago made. In fact, if you try to pay for contraceptive in a European country, they're totally surprised and outraged. They say, well, of course we wouldn't charge you for that. So I think that's a very important thing. And I guess I think it was just ill-judged of the church to make a big issue of that. And I don't think that Americans were swayed by that. As it's very interesting in the latest election that all the politicians who made rather sort of strident statements that implicated women's health and safety lost, including one, my local congressman, who actually said there's no case, not one case, where abortion is necessary to save the life of the mother. Well, they want to make up biology and medical science too, right? They can make up evolutionary science, they can make up climate science, and now they're going to make up medical science. And so he lost by quite a large margin in what up till that point had been a closely contested election. So I think that Obama has been, if anything, rather mild on some of these issues, and I don't think the bishops have a leg to stand on, actually.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, first of all, congratulations on a wonderful lecture. I work in international development, and I'm familiar with Islamic and its frontiers, Malaysia, Senegal, Kosovo, places like that. But I had an experience in Afghanistan in 2011, which I found troubling, and I would like to sort of see your reaction. I was there for UNDP, doing some final evaluations, and was supposed to be taken to a a development agency in the green zone from UNDP, a new driver, a new UN driver, did not take me the normal back way where you maintain, essentially you're in the green zone the whole time. He got lost and dropped me off on the other side in the middle of Masud Square, where I could have gone in to a long walk to a long sidewalk and a turnstile that would have taken me in the other way. It was insufficient job for being dumped in the middle of such a public place. Loose slacks, a headscarf, a blouse, not long enough, and that sort of thing. And I felt like a target. It was a very interesting walk, shall we say. And at that point, even though I know that the burka, the mesh in front of the eyes makes everything blurry. The fact that it's so narrow cuts off all peripheral vision. But I longed for one, and I understood perfectly why they're all anonymous, why none are embroidered or individualized as we find in adult states, because that's the whole objective. And having had this sort of experience with, oh boy, I wish I were wearing a burqa, regardless of this, it was because, but what I sensed was the hostility, what I sensed was the fact that I was intruding in turf where I had no right to be. And even with the burqa, I would have been semi-intruding, as I see. But, all right, so here in its homeland, what would you say to something like that, where the women wear it out of fear for doing anything else?
Well, I'm talking about countries that are liberal democracies that have accepted the idea that all people are equal in human dignity. So if we want to start talking about a place like Afghanistan, I guess my first reaction is there's so much else that's wrong that we have to start back there. That is getting an acknowledgement of equal human dignity, and then we can get to the dress code that flows from that. It's much, in a way, it's much easier to, not politically, but philosophically, easier to address such things when they occur in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, as they would, indeed, and, to talk about women who are pelted with feces and stoned and so on when they try to pray at the wall, because that is a democracy that at least nominally and often really respects equal human rights. So then we can talk about what their regime should be and what judges should say. But when we deal with a country that's just not accountable yet, I just hope someday it would happen, then I guess I want to back up further and say we first of all have to put in place guarantees of human rights protection for everyone across the board, and an end to violence against persons on any ground, whether ethnicity, gender, whatever. Then we can start talking about whether there's a dress code restriction that might plausibly be required. And look, in Israel, it gets very fine-tuning very quickly, like things like they want to ban singing by the equivalent of USO in the army because the female voice should not be heard by the Orthodox men, and so it's connected to the fact that more Orthodox men are now going to be serving in the army. Now that's the kind of case we could argue about, and we could say, what does the accommodation of religion require in a case like that, and how the rights of self-expression of the female soldiers who want to sing, how do we balance that against the religious restrictions of the Orthodox men? So I feel like I know how to set that up philosophically and legally, but I don't have an idea. With Afghanistan, it's first of all a matter of establishing human rights, personal security, and then we would move on to that question. And whenever, of course, people are wearing anything because they're afraid, whether it's, concealing their race, concealing their gender, concealing their transgender, that's a very bad situation. It's a situation where human rights are not being protected.
We have time for one last question. Who wants hands back here? In the blue shirt.
Can I press the argument about the Catholic bishops? Because I thought you would go the other way. The reason I thought you'd go the other way is because the Catholic bishops represent a minority position. They're being coerced to use some of their funds to pay for something that they think is a violation of their conscience. And your argument is not about a compelling state interest in this case. state could easily use taxpayer funds out of general revenues to support universal subsidy for contraception, as some European countries do. But here they're requiring private party A pay private party B for something that they think infringes their conscience. And I would have thought under your principles, that's something that ought to be protected. It's patriarchal, we have, we have egalitarian commitments, we reject it, but that's just like the burka. Right?
Okay, no, I mean, this is a very good question, and let me try to say more. I guess my principle does entail that no Catholic individual should have to directly perform a function that that person's conscience forbids, such as forcing a Catholic doctor to perform an abortion, a Catholic pharmacist to fill a prescription for the morning after pill. In all of those cases, I do think accommodation is both possible and required, so long as we make sure that those functions will be performed by somebody else. And I think that's usually possible to do. In this case, it just doesn't seem to me the same kind of case because it's not a burden on the individual. What we're talking about is a large organization that provides health insurance to all its employees, most of whom in some of these cases are non-Catholics, but it doesn't really matter because Catholics can choose to obey or not obey. They're not under the ukaz of the Pope. So, and it's the insurance. So what the Catholics are doing is paying for an insurance policy. And that's done by the administration of the hospital. It's not, I would say, you can't even say what individual is doing that. They're paying for an insurance policy, and then the contraceptive coverage is something that the individual claims under that insurance policy, and the insurance company, which is itself not a Catholic entity, is making the payments. So I don't think it's the same kind of thing. The accommodation cases all involve an individual who's coerced into doing something, either serving in the military, refraining from smoking peyote, not getting the unemployment compensation that she wants, and so on. And I don't think this is the same kind of case because it's just a bureaucracy that makes a contract. They made a contract with an insurance company, and now that insurance company is doing some things, of course with an individual patient making a claim, that they don't particularly like. Well, I don't think that, so I don't see that as a kind of conscientious burden in the same sense. I think we would have to talk for a long time and go back and forth on it, and I can see that you would have a comeback here and you would try to, you'd have to specify who is it who's being coerced, and does the coercion just consist in the fact that they're required to make a contract with an insurance company, or the fact that they're required to choose among insurance companies that provide a certain kind of coverage? Or anyway, I think myself that that's what the second Obama policy did, was to make it very indirect, mediated by the insurance companies, so that no Catholic individual had to actually go out there and write a prescription for contraception. And that's what I think would be a burden on conscience. I mean, this is, to me, no different from a Catholic who lives in a country which provides contraception. I mean, it's about as attenuated as the solution that you propose. But anyhow, you may not be satisfied with that, and we'd have to talk at great length. But thanks, that is a very good question.
Well, thanks for coming the other direction, really. So please, let's thank Mark. Last chance. We have a reception out here, and then we assemble to have conversation on the humanities and the university at 3.